For over a century, American orphanages were seen as safe havens, but behind closed doors many hid abuse, neglect, and deep emotional trauma. Created to manage the growing number of homeless children, these institutions often prioritize discipline, over care, and control over compassion. This dark history reveals what truly happened to the forgotten children of America, and why their stories must never be erased. The story of American orphanages begins in the shadows of industrialization, immigration, and disease. By the early 1800s, major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were teeming with families who had fled rural poverty or European hardship, only to find new misery in America's crowded, unsanitary urban centers. Widespread illness, unsafe factory work, and rising poverty created a perfect storm. Parents died. Mothers were left widowed and overwhelmed. Some children were abandoned not from cruelty, but from desperation. Faced with growing numbers of street children, often referred to as vagabonds or waifs, the American elite responded with what they saw as a moral duty to control, discipline, and save these children. But their version of saving didn't mean nurturing love. It meant religious instruction, moral conformity, and obedience. Wealthy reformers and Protestant churches began founding orphan asylums, not only to house these children, but to reshape them into docile, God-fearing members of society. Institutions like the Orphan Asylum Society of the City of New York, founded in 1806, or the Boston Female Asylum, established in 1800, weren't primarily focused on children's happiness or personal development. Instead, they were often rooted in the belief that poverty was the result of moral failure, and that children, if not strictly guided, would fall into criminality or moral ruin. The term orphan itself was often loosely applied. Many of the children placed in orphanages were not truly orphaned. Some had one living parent, typically a mother struggling to survive without resources, but poverty was often equated with unfitness, especially among immigrants, people of color, and unwed mothers. These children were taken, sometimes voluntarily, often coercively, and raised by an institution that treated them not as human beings, but as projects. From the outside, orphanages symbolized Christian charity and civic virtue. Inside, they were far from sanctuaries. They became places of containment, surveillance, and silence, a foreshadowing of the darker systems of institutionalization that would follow in the next century. Once admitted into an orphanage, a child's life became a life of control, regulated down to the minute, stripped of individuality and steeped in discipline. Every morning began with prayers. Beds were made with military precision. Meals were eaten in silence. Children wore uniforms, spoke only when spoken to, and followed rules that left no room for personal expression. Many orphanages were overcrowded, with dozens or even hundreds of children managed by just a handful of poorly trained staff. The buildings themselves were austere. Rows of metal beds in large, drafty dormitories, long wooden tables for silent meals, walls often bare of color or joy. The goal wasn't comfort, it was order. The children were expected to work. Chores, such as scrubbing floors, washing dishes, mending clothing, and maintaining the grounds were part of daily life, even for very young children. Older boys might be loaned out to farms or factories. Girls were often trained for domestic service from as early as age 10. This labor wasn't just a learning tool, it was a financial engine for the institutions. Punishment was common, and often brutal. Speaking during meals, failing to memorize Bible verses, or displaying any defiance could result in corporal punishment, beatings, isolation, or loss of meals. Crying was not met with comfort, but with reprimand. Bedwetting, a common trauma response in children, was treated as moral weakness and punished harshly, but beyond the physical was the emotional starvation. Hugs were rare. Praise, rarer still. Babies were sometimes kept in cribs for most of the day with minimal interaction. Children were discouraged from forming attachments to each other, believing that bonds between orphans would lead to disobedience or jealousy. A culture of fear took root. Even in institutions that avoided physical abuse, emotional neglect and suppression were baked into the structure. Some children tried to escape. Others learned to shrink themselves, to stop needing, stop wanting, stop speaking. Years later, survivors would recall the silence as the most haunting part. These weren't homes. They were machines. Machines designed to break poverty by breaking children first. Behind the heavy wooden doors and stained glass windows of American orphanages, a disturbing reality festered, one that few dared to confront publicly until much later. The very adults trusted to care for children became perpetrators of harm, often with impunity. In a society that idolized religious charity and respected institutional authority, abuse was not only rampant, it was systematically silenced. Physical abuse was commonplace. Staff used belts, switches, or wooden paddles to punish children for minor infractions such as talking back, bedwetting, or failing to recite scriptures. In some orphanages, beatings became ritualistic, a form of control masked as discipline. Punishments were often delivered in front of other children to instill fear. In winter, children might be made to kneel on cold floors or stand barefoot outside for hours. Some were locked in dark closets or basements as a form of solitary punishment, sometimes for days. Emotional abuse was less visible but equally scarring. Children were constantly reminded they were unwanted, broken, or unworthy of love. They were told they were burdens. Those who cried for their parents or asked questions were mocked, humiliated, or ignored. Many were shamed for expressing normal emotions or seeking comfort from others. Over time, these children learned to numb themselves, their self-worth crushed by years of neglect. Sexual abuse was the darkest and most hidden aspect of orphanage life. With little oversight, some staff, including clergy members, used their authority to prey on children. Girls and boys alike were vulnerable. In some horrific cases, abuse rings operated inside these institutions for years, unchecked by law enforcement or church leadership. Children who tried to speak out were disbelieved or punished. The fear of retaliation kept many silent well into adulthood. Exploitation extended beyond abuse. Many orphanages made money off their children's labor. Some institutions struck deals with local factories, farms, or households, effectively renting out children for domestic work, field labor, or industrial jobs under the guise of training or placement. These children had no say in the matter. Wages, if paid at all, went to the orphanage. In many cases, children were overworked, underfed, and treated as disposable. It wasn't until the 20th century that whistleblowers, often former residents, began to reveal the full extent of these horrors. Investigative journalists exposed systemic cruelty, triggering public outrage and calls for reform. But for countless children who had already passed through these doors, the damage had long been done. Not all children were treated equally within the American orphanage system. In fact, many weren't accepted at all. The architecture of the orphanage system was built upon white Protestant ideals, which meant that children of color, immigrant children, and those from undesirable backgrounds were often excluded, mistreated, or erased entirely. Black children, especially in the South, were either refused admission or placed in entirely separate and severely underfunded institutions. These orphanages were frequently nothing more than shacks with no heat, medical care, or qualified teachers. In many cases, black children were instead sent to work farms, chain gangs, or training schools that operated more like prisons than homes. Their labor was exploited, their education minimal, and their safety non-existent. Many of these institutions were directly tied to the Jim Crow legal structure, reinforcing white supremacy through systemic neglect. Indigenous children faced their own unique tragedy. Many were taken from their families under the authority of the federal government and placed in boarding schools or religious orphanages under policies of forced assimilation. Their hair was cut, names changed, and languages beaten out of them. They were told their culture was savage, their heritage shameful. These acts were not just neglectful, they were genocidal. Immigrant children, especially those of Irish, Italian, or Eastern European descent, were also subject to discrimination. In Protestant-run orphanages, they were often coerced into renouncing Catholicism or were considered inherently less moral. Some were labeled feeble-minded or unfit for society simply because they didn't speak English or looked different. The rise of eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th century further weaponized the orphanage system. Influenced by pseudo-scientific ideas about hereditary traits, some institutions began to screen children for desirable characteristics. Those with disabilities, mental illness, or even just poor family backgrounds were often denied proper care or were forcibly sterilized. Girls in particular were frequent targets of this brutal policy, robbed of their reproductive rights before they even reached adulthood. The question of who deserved to be saved was no longer just about orphan status. It became about race, class, ability, and conformity. And for countless children who didn't fit that mold, the system did not save them. It erased them. In 1854, a new chapter in American orphan history began, one that promised salvation but often delivered tragedy. The orphan train movement, launched by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society, aimed to relocate abandoned and impoverished children from overcrowded eastern cities to rural towns in the Midwest and beyond. It was promoted as a humanitarian effort. In reality, it commodified children and placed them into the hands of strangers, with little regulation or follow-up. Over the next 75 years, more than 200,000 children were loaded onto westbound trains. These children, often dressed in matching uniforms, were paraded from town to town where potential adopters inspected them like livestock. Town halls and train platforms became makeshift marketplaces. Strong boys were prized for farm labor. Pretty girls were picked for domestic work, the promise of a new family, too often translated into indentured servitude. Brace and his reformers believed that removing children from the corrupting influence of the city and placing them in the moral heartland would save their souls. But there was no background check, no guarantee of affection, and little protection from abuse. Many children were taken in, not as sons or daughters, but as unpaid workers. Reports surfaced of children being beaten, overworked, neglected, or abandoned again. Some were passed from one home to another, like tools. The trauma of separation also ran deep. Siblings were rarely kept together. Some children were given new names and forced to forget their pasts. Others never saw their biological families again, even if a parent or relative was still alive. For these children, the train was not a lifeline. It was a one-way ticket to loss, exploitation, and identity erasure. By the 1920s, public criticism of the orphan train system intensified. Social workers, journalists, and former writers began to question the morality of uprooting children and treating them as property. Eventually, the movement faded, giving way to more structured systems of adoption and foster care. But the legacy of those trains, of children sold with smiles and sermons, left deep scars across generations. By the early 20th century, cracks in the orphanage system had become too deep to ignore. Investigations revealed widespread abuse, corruption, and neglect. Survivor testimonies and journalist exposés painted a horrifying picture that shattered the illusion of orphanages as benevolent sanctuaries. The public, once trusting, began to turn against the very institutions they had long revered. The Progressive Era, 1890s, 1920s, ushered in a wave of reformers who championed child welfare as a national concern. Women like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, and organizations like the National Child Labor Committee, fought for better living conditions, the end of child labor, and the idea that every child deserved love, not just structure. The concept of family-based care began to take hold. Reformers argued that no institution, no matter how well funded, could replicate the emotional support of a home. Foster care, though still imperfect, was introduced as a way to place children in individual family settings rather than massive dormitories. Laws began to change. The Social Security Act of 1935 provided federal funding for dependent children, giving struggling families alternatives to institutionalization. Licensing standards for care homes were developed. By the mid-20th century, orphanages were in steep decline, slowly replaced by a patchwork of foster care programs, adoption agencies, and social services. But the transition was far from smooth. While orphanages diminished in number, group homes, state-run juvenile facilities, and private foster care systems inherited many of the same problems: underfunding, abuse, and lack of oversight. Some orphanages simply rebranded themselves to survive, continuing harmful practices under new names. Still, the resistance and reform movements brought undeniable change. Survivors spoke out, whistleblowers were finally heard, and children, once silenced, began to have voices in decisions about their own futures. The orphanage, as a central institution in American life, was dying, but the lessons it left behind were still unfolding, and the damage it caused continued to shape the landscape of child welfare for decades to come. Though most traditional orphanages closed their doors by the late 20th century, the trauma they inflicted did not. The children who lived through them grew into adults carrying invisible wounds, shaped not only by neglect and abuse, but by the absence of love, identity, and belonging. Many orphanage survivors struggled with long-term psychological damage: chronic anxiety, depression, attachment disorders, and post-traumatic stress. Raised in institutions where emotion was punished and connection denied, they often found it difficult to build healthy relationships or trust others. Some described growing up with a void they could never explain, a quiet grief for the childhood they never truly had. In recent decades, survivors have begun to break their silence. Memoirs, documentaries, and support groups have given voice to those who once had none. Their stories, heartbreaking, resilient, and enraging, have helped expose the full extent of the orphanage system's failings. Former residents of institutions, like the St. Joseph's Orphanage in Vermont, Mount Cashel Orphanage in Newfoundland, and New York Foundling Hospital, came forward with harrowing tales of beatings, starvation, and systemic sexual abuse. Their testimonies have led to lawsuits, investigations, and, in some rare cases, public apologies. Despite these revelations, justice remains elusive for many. Statutes of limitation often prevent legal recourse. Many institutions were affiliated with religious or state powers that deflected blame or denied wrongdoing. Even now, survivors continue to fight for recognition, reparations, and healing. The legacy of orphanages also lingers in the modern foster care system, where some of the same structural problems, underfunding, lack of oversight, racial and class disparities, continue to place vulnerable children at risk. Although the intentions behind child welfare reform are nobler today, systemic failures remain. Children still get lost in the system. Abuse still happens. And emotional neglect, though less visible, persists in group homes and overburdened foster placements. The orphanage system may be a relic of the past, but its echoes are still heard in the voices of those who survived it. The history of American orphanages is not just a record of brick buildings, dusty dormitories, or forgotten ledgers. It is a human story, etched in the minds of children who were left behind, institutionalized, and silenced. It is a story of how society chose discipline over love, control over care, and respectability over humanity. Looking back, the system was built more to serve the fears and moral values of adults than the needs of the children. It was built on the belief that poor children needed to be fixed rather than nurtured. And it punished those who were already suffering. Today, as we examine the systems that replaced orphanages, we must ask hard questions. Are we listening to children? Are we creating spaces that heal, or simply institutions that contain? Have we truly learned from the past, or are we repeating it under a different name? Remembering what happened behind the closed doors of America's orphanages is not about dwelling in darkness. It's about bringing the truth to light, honoring those who endured the silence, and ensuring that never again will vulnerable children be forgotten in the name of order, morality, or charity.